Everyone knows Assassin's Creed. But how well do you remember the game that kicked off the franchise that so far includes 12 games, a movie, and even a series of comics? The highlight of the franchise for me has always been the Ezio series, but I remember obsessively wanting to complete this first game back in 2007, despite not really enjoying it that much. But is it as boring and repetitive as I remember? Or are there elements that override this to still provide some enjoyment today? Let's take a look, shall we? Along with how this first game came to be. As I was streaming Assassin's Creed, a viewer commented that it looks more like a Prince of Persia game, which immediately became relevant when I started researching this game's development. After the 2003 release of Prince of Persia: Sands of Time, creative director Patrice Désilets was given free rein by Ubisoft to start work on the next-gen successor to Prince of Persia, a title that would eventually release on the Xbox 360 and PS3. He began work on Prince of Persia: Assassin, which is what this 2004 prototype footage is of. Désilets was a fan of history and started researching the Middle East to try and find something he could use on the next-gen title. That's when he found the Hashashin, an order of assassins from the 12th century that would publicly execute their targets in an over-the-top fashion in order to get their enemies to fall in line. He essentially took the best of Prince of Persia and mixed in some stealth aspects from Splinter Cell, another Ubisoft creation, to envisage a new kind of game where the player would complete amazing acrobatic feats in an open-world environment whilst jumping in and out of the shadows. The original plan for the title was for it to follow a more linear approach like the Sands of Time, but as more information became available on the capabilities of the next-gen consoles, they considered expanding the acrobatic gameplay into an open-world scenario. After some persuasion, Ubisoft greenlit this idea as an entirely new franchise. They also teamed Désilets up with Jade Raymond, who had experience with creating vast open worlds. With the team in place, they began work. They tried to keep the story and setting as accurate as possible to the history books about these 12th century assassins, so they recreated Masyaf, which was the home of the Order of Assassins, as well as the cities of Damascus and Jerusalem. The first assassin, Altair, was tasked with killing 9 prominent individuals based on real historical figures. In order to further remove the game from its Prince of Persia roots, the main story was actually set in the modern day, which I will discuss in the next section of this video. Ubisoft pulled out all the stops on production and gave its new franchise a prime holiday slot in November 2007. They were so confident the game would be a hit, they even let it drop in the same window as that year's most hyped title, Halo 3. The game was both hugely successful and disappointing. Assassin's Creed obviously appealed to gamers and sold more than 9 million copies, but game critics were unimpressed with certain aspects of the game, which I will also discuss. A unique element of this game is the 2 intertwined plot lines, one in the modern day with Desmond Miles, and another with Altair in the 12th century. Bartender Desmond Miles is kidnapped by a company called Abstergo Industries for use as a test subject with their Animus, a device that can simulate genetic memory. Abstergo uses Desmond to access the memories of his ancestor, Altair, a member of the Assassin Brotherhood in the year 1191, who lived during the Third Crusade in the Holy Land. The game opens with Desmond entering Altair's memories but facing severe synchronization problems. I forgot about this part and thought my controller just wasn't working properly at the time. We can hear the voices of Lucy Stillman and Warren Vidic arguing over Desmond's safety within the Animus. When Desmond exits the Animus, Warren briefs him on how the machine works and initialises a handy tutorial program for us to work through. I don't recall this move in the other games though. After Desmond is done with his tutorial, he enters the closest synchronisable memory of Altair. Lucy adds that Desmond has to relive key moments of Altair's life to increase his synchronisation, or health bar, before reaching the final memory which holds the information that Abstergo is seeking. The first memory Desmond accesses is Altair attempting to retrieve one of a series of artefacts known as the Pieces of Eden, alongside 2 members of the Brotherhood, Malik and his brother Kadar. They are both stopped by Robert de Sable, Grand Master of the Knights Templar and sworn enemy of the assassins. While retrieving the treasure, Altair breaks all 3 tenets of the Assassin's Creed in an attempt to kill Robert. Stay one's blade from the flesh of the innocent, draw not attention to oneself whenever possible, and never compromise the Brotherhood. But ultimately he fails anyway. In the following commotion, Malik's brother is killed, and Malik's arm is left crippled and later amputated. When Altair returns to the assassin's stronghold at Masyaf to apologise, Malik comes back with the artefact and belittles Altair because of his arrogance. After narrowly defeating a retaliatory attack by the Templars, Al-Mualim, leader of the assassins, demotes Altair to a novice, but gives him the chance to prove himself and rise up through the ranks of the Brotherhood by assassinating 9 key figures in Jerusalem, Acre and Damascus. Each target is based on an actual historical figure from the Third Crusade. One thing I was struck by is just how dark this game is, as it showcases that these people are just the worst of the worst for the time. A notable moment for me was when a patient escapes from Garnier de Naplouse, but is brought back to him. Garnier orders his legs be broken so he doesn't do it again, all while we watch from Altair's perspective. Altair's memories are split into blocks within the Animus, so at the end of each one we return to Desmond's perspective, who is doing a bit of digging of his own into what is happening at Abstergo. Lucy allows him access to her computer, and through snooping at her emails we learn that she is trying to find out details about a co-worker's supposed suicide, which are being kept secret. As Altair eliminates each target, he learns that all 9 of his targets are actually members of the Templar Order and were conspiring to locate the Apple of Eden, one of these pieces of Eden we learned about earlier. Finally, Altair takes on the assassination of his final target, Robert de Sable. During his initial attempt to assassinate him at a funeral in Jerusalem, Altair is tricked with a decoy, which was obvious when playing the mission as he had a distinctly feminine voice. The decoy reveals that Robert anticipated the assassins would come for him and went to negotiate an alliance between the Crusaders and Saracens against them. Altair catches up to Robert in the camp of King Richard I and exposes his crimes. Unsure of who to believe, Richard suggests a 1-to-1 duel to decide the truth, remarking that God will decide the victor. After Altair mortally wounds Robert, he confesses that Al-Mualim betrayed the assassins and eventually the Templars, seeking the Apple of Eden for himself. Returning to Masyaf, Altair finds Al-Mualim using the apple to control both the inhabitants and the other assassins. The imagery and colour palette during this part was quite unsettling, and I felt conflicted having to defend myself against these brainwashed citizens. With the help of several assassins brought in for backup by Malik, Altair storms the citadel and confronts his mentor in the gardens. Using the apple, Al-Mualim battles his apprentice with illusions before resorting to single combat. Altair stabs him with his hidden blade and tries to destroy the apple, but instead unlocks a secret map which reveals the location of countless other pieces of Eden around the world. Meanwhile, back in the present day, the assassins launch an unsuccessful attack on the Abstergo facility to rescue Desmond, resulting in most of them being killed. After completing Altair's memories, Vidic reveals to Desmond that Abstergo is actually the modern-day incarnation of the Templars, seeking to find the remaining pieces of Eden. With Desmond having outlived his usefulness, Vidic's superiors prepare to have him killed, but Lucy, who is strongly implied to be a mole for the assassins, convinces them to keep him alive for further testing. Desmond is left alone in his room, where he discovers strange drawings on the wall foretelling a catastrophic event that will wipe out humanity. And there, the game abruptly ends, leaving us hanging. Despite this game's flaw regarding gameplay, I love the plot, and ultimately is what hooked me into the series despite the repetitiveness of Altair's tasks. For me, the modern day plot with Desmond is what elevates this story, and the intrigue created around the pieces of Eden and their origin was enough to get me completely hooked. Although not the most charismatic of protagonists, Altair has the presence of someone who is the master of assassins, at the peak of his career. I did enjoy finding out about each of his targets, and the deep conversations with Al-Mualim were given extra depth once you learn of his betrayal. One of my big criticisms, and probably everyone else's, is just how repetitive this game is. In between all this repetitiveness at the beginning of the game is also having to ride your horse for what felt like an eternity to unlock each city, also while apparently having 100 flags to collect in this in-between area alone. I'm all for a completionist playthrough, but just no. At a stretch I would be willing to hunt down and kill all the Templar Knights, because there's at least some fun to be had there. Another gripe I had is these aggressive drunks, and whoever these guys are as well, who roam the streets and seem to zone in on you any opportunity they get. Occasionally they'll knock you into the guards, which is just inconvenient when about 10 of them come running to attack you. The beggars are also incredibly annoying and are lurking on every corner, pleading to you with the same couple of lines of dialogue and just generally being in the way. I'm not ashamed to say that after I was several hours into this game, I did just resort to grabbing and throwing them. Each area starts out the same way. You save a citizen outside the city gates, which then allows you to blend with scholars to enter the city. Then I needed to do all the viewpoints and save a variety of citizens, or do some eavesdropping, or interrogate people, to name a few. Once I'd gathered enough intel, I was able to return to the Assassin's Bureau and trigger the assassination mission. The targets themselves do thankfully provide some variety. A notable one I always remember being the merchant who poisoned everyone at a party. This first game is actually quite forgiving with the assassinations, and I've found them quite hard to even fail. The parkour is pretty bad, but actually not as bad as I remember. It can get frustrating during the chase scenes or rooftop races though, where Altair will get stuck halfway up climbing up a building, or just jump off the side into the water for no apparent reason at all. It was manageable when I could take my time a bit more, but I kind of take for granted that you can just keep pressing forward in the later games and it does all the work for you. Aside from the free running, I even managed to fail at a leap of faith. But thankfully this bug didn't happen too often. I also had numerous issues with the camera whilst playing as Desmond. It doesn't seem to like you moving the camera around when he's near a person or an object to interact with, even though I was trying to move the camera just to see where I was going. If you're playing on a PC like me and want to use a controller, which I would highly advise with any of these games, you need to consider which one you're using. I initially plugged in my Razer Raiju, but this came with some unique challenges, meaning I would basically have to remap all of the controls. For some reason, instead of using the thumbstick to look, you use the triggers, which is just wrong. I was able to change this, but then was unable to map anything else to the triggers, which is something of an issue because you use them all of the time. I then went down the internet rabbit hole of fixes and controller emulators to get it working perfectly, but as a last-ditch effort I plugged in a wired Xbox 360 controller, which thankfully worked a treat with no remapping necessary at all. Once you get the ability to counter, the combat does start to feel a bit overpowered in favour of the player, to the point where you could probably fight at least 20 enemies all at once without a scratch on you. As Altair's abilities progress though, so do the enemies. Eventually they're able to break your defence and use heavy attacks that can't be countered, forcing you to be slightly more creative and dodge. But nevertheless, the combat throughout the whole game can still be successfully approached using the button mashing method, which did result in me having a squeaky X button by the time I was finished. I also occasionally had issues with the camera during combat, where a tree or something would be obstructing the camera, which would end up with me being hit because I couldn't see a damn thing. The camera also felt like it would jump around a bit too, which made it harder to follow during chaotic scenes. Unlike the following games, we don't have loads of extra weapons or gadgets at our disposal, just the short sword, throwing knives and the hidden blade, or our fists if we're beating up someone for an interrogation. This does also mean that the combat elements are very repetitive as well. So when I was doing side missions, I grew bored of doing the same thing over and over. So the combat invokes the same feeling as the overall gameplay as Altair's section, but for some reason, I still can't put it down. So does the first Assassin's Creed game hold up after all this time? Yes and no. For me, it was great to revisit the franchise's roots and relive what got me hooked into the series. But in that respect, it almost made me feel sad, because it feels like the series ended when Desmond's story did. All these years later, I still feel like I'm waiting for a compelling modern day story again, with Layla's plot just not feeling fleshed out enough or given the attention that could make it great. But aside from my gripes with the overall franchise, I did enjoy replaying this. It handles well enough. It is frustrating and repetitive, but I was also able to blitz through the entire game in a few hours. It's also a good one to boot up if you don't really fancy engaging your brain. I'm not sure if that's a selling point though. Most of all though, playing this game has made me want to go on to relive the magic of the Ezio trilogy, and for that alone, it was worth my time. As always, thank you for watching. If you have any thoughts on this game, leave them below in the comments. And if you liked the video, please give it a like. If you disliked it, please dislike it. And also consider subscribing.